My name is Rafael Cardoso. I'm an art historian, and I'm the great-grandson of Hugo Simon. Hugo Zeman was a banker, activist, and art collector in Germany before the Second World War, and he went into exile in 1933 and ended up in Brazil in 1941. That's how my father, who was then a 10-year-old boy, ended up in Brazil. I was not aware of this story for most of my younger life. I first learned about Hugo Simon. I first heard his name when I was 16 years old. I was told, your great-grandfather was very wealthy, very influential banker, Jewish in Germany, and that's all I can tell you. And I'm not going to, and you can't talk about it. I was 16, and I was told, up to that point, I had not known almost any of this, and it was a real shock for me, and I didn't really deal with it until after my grandaunt died when I was 23. And that's when I came into possession of photographs, papers, documents. And that's when I started piecing together the story and learning about all the things that I hadn't been told my whole life. My German background, my Jewish background, the family history, all the things that people thought you weren't supposed to talk about that. A lot of Holocaust survivor families, you hear this phrase, no, we didn't talk about that. That was the taboo subject. And this was always a taboo subject. I mean, literally, if someone spoke German in the same room as my father would stand up and leave the room. This is just like, there was no discussion. So I grew up with this whole secrets and lie atmosphere. And then I started figuring it out that other people also grew up in the same atmosphere. And I really think that the best thing that can happen is to have open and honest conversations about this. Fast forward a couple of decades, and I came to Germany in 2012 to start research into a book about the whole story. And the more I researched, the more I found, and the more I found, the more people I met, and eventually it ended up sort of becoming bigger than I expected it to. It's not about families stealing or looting works of art from museums. And it's not about accusing museums of having looted works of art from families. It's about families and museums getting together to come up with just and fair solutions. There have been beautiful examples where works have been restituted and the heirs donate them to public institutions. And that's just incredibly generous. At the same time, those heirs had the opportunity of closure. They had the opportunity to heal the wounds. They had the opportunity to come to terms with their loss and their grief. And then when they give the work back to an institution, then they're actually giving something as opposed to having something stolen from them. It's completely different. It's completely different to give something of your own accord and to have it stolen from you. That anger and that resentment and the pain of not getting something back over decades and decades and decades, and the humiliation of it too. It is humiliating. It's humiliating for the people who lose things. Loss is humiliating. I think this is why a lot of these families that survived the Holocaust and survived spoliation and survived exile and being refugees, one of the reasons they don't talk about it is that there's a shame. There's survivor's guilt. There's a shame of having lost all that you had. These are very painful things. And we have to take all this into account when we're talking about looted art. Looted art is not just about the art. It's not just about dollars and cents. And it's not even just about legal arguments. It's a cycle that has no end until you come to terms with it. And if we don't make peace, it's not going to end. It just comes back to haunt you. Hugo Simon was quite a dynamic character. He was a banker in Berlin. He started banking around 1911, and he was a very successful banker during the Weimar Republic. Around the time of the First World War, he became engaged also as an activist in the pacifist movement. He was against the war with France, and they set up a league. It later became the German League for Human Rights. It was a very unpopular league at the time because most people were very patriotic in Germany. But some very prominent people were in this group, along with my great-grandfather. People like Albert Einstein, Stefan Zweig were involved in this pacifist anti-war movement. When the war came to an end, the First World War, Hugo Simon got involved directly in politics. That's when he became Minister of Finance for the state of Prussia for the USPD, which was the Independent Socialist Party. He was only in government for about 6 weeks because there was a coalition government between the Independent Socialists and the Regular Socialist Party, and they fell out in early January 1919. This is immediately after the November Revolution in 18. The majority socialists were supportive of war credits, and the independent socialists were pacifists, and they left the government. So he left the government with that group. It was a very intense period. He was a very active person in the November Revolution. Basically, he's a kind of figure that doesn't exist anymore, an activist banker. That was his situation until the early Weimar Republic. Then he sort of moved away from politics, moved away from the political activism, and became more of a cultural activist. And that's when he became a big art collector. He was a patron of the National Gallery in Berlin, and he was on its advisory board for acquisitions. So he became a sort of prominent figure in the artistic world in Berlin in the 20s and 30s. And then, of course, because of his whole background, pacifist, socialist, Jewish, he was on the first list of people that they wanted to arrest in 33. So in March 33, 1 month after the Reichstag fire, he left Berlin and fled to Paris. And that's where they remained for 7 years. Hugo Simon set up a brokerage firm in 35 and started basically doing financial business for the German exile community. Then he sort of built himself up again in Paris, and he became a big backer of the anti-Nazi movement in the German exile in France. He was one of the backers of the Pariser Tageszeitung, which was the most important exile newspaper in the German language. And he was also involved in the Committee for Refugees. So he was very, very engaged in the exile refugee community in Paris, especially after 37. But at that time, he was selling a lot of artworks, too, to finance the activities that he was undertaking in Paris. He was supporting a lot of artists and writers. He was one of the financial mainstays of this very small, close-knit German exile community. Hugo Zeman was a fairly eclectic collector. There's a little of everything in his collection. He had a lot of 19th century art. He had Courbets and Monets. He had also some old masters. But the great strength of his collection was the contemporary 20th century German art. That's what makes his collection stand out. He had very exceptional works from all the right names. He tends to have works that today are museum quality, today are hanging in some of the great museums of the world. Hugo Zeman was back and forth between France and Switzerland around 1938, 39. He was negotiating parts of his collection that he had managed to get out of Germany and into Switzerland. And there are a lot of dealings at this time involving credits, where the museums would give him credit in exchange for works from his collection as collateral. Basically, he was selling works to finance his activities in France. The French police were spying on him at this time. We know from the police reports that his business started going very badly after 36, 37. This is exactly the time when he was getting more and more engaged in the anti-Nazi activities in Paris. He provided major loans to keep the Pariser Tageszeitung newspaper afloat. He had a lot of financial commitments that went way beyond his family and lifestyle. He was financially engaged in the anti-Nazi resistance. Of course, the money had to come from somewhere. So since the business was going badly, since all of his assets in Germany were frozen and confiscated, the one place he could get money was by selling art. And unfortunately, the art market was terrible at this time. There was too much expressionism available, not many people interested in it. Even what he did sell legally was sold for what today are ridiculous prices. My view of it is that most or all of these sales were under duress. He was selling things for bargain basement prices because he had no other choice. And that's not the view that the Swiss lawyers generally have taken in the past. But I think that's the tide is starting to change in that sense. When the Nazis invaded Paris, he, of course, had to flee again. The French government was still in power. And at that time, they evacuated a number of prominent refugees from Paris. And Hugo Zeman was among them. When the French government finally collapsed, they all found their way to Marseille. Everyone was going to Marseille and Narbonne at this time because these were the only ways out of France. Hugo Zeman and Gertrude Zeman, my great-grandmother, they found their way to Marseille. I think they were there by September 1940. And then they remained in Marseille trying to get out. This is the really tense, dramatic period when everyone is trying to get out of France. And most people are not managing to get out of France. They had heard on German radio broadcasts, there was a list read out of people who were wanted by the Nazi regime in Berlin, and he was on that list. So he knew that there was something going on. They, of course, were not aware of Article 19 of the Armistice, which was where the Vichy government committed to handing over all of the Jewish and leftist exiles to the Nazis in Berlin. And they didn't know about this, but they could pretty much figure it out because no one was getting exit visas from France. So actually, Hugo Zeman was able to get a temporary entry visa to the US, but he had no passport. He had no valid passport in his own name. And even if he did, he couldn't get an exit visa because the French wouldn't give him an exit visa. So this was a very, very tricky situation at this time. You had to have an entry visa for some country, you had to have a valid travel document, and you had to have a French exit visa, all three aligned at once. And the exit visas were only valid for 2 weeks. So sometimes people would get one and they couldn't get another. So people were in this cat and mouse game for months on end. And of course, the great hero of this time, everyone knows in the US, is Varian Fry, who set up the Emergency Rescue Committee. And Varian Fry got at least a couple of thousand people out of southern France at this time. Basically, intellectuals, labor leaders, artists. And it's very likely that Hugo Zeman was one of the people that he got out. Since he couldn't get the exit visa to leave France, he finally left France using a fake Czech passport. And he left the overland route. Basically, you cross the Pyrenees on foot. Many exiles took this route. And the fact that Hugo Zeman left on a Czech passport is a telltale sign, because one of Varian Fry's big suppliers of fake documents was the Czech government in exile, had a consul in Marseille. And he gave Varian Fry a few thousand blank passports. And this is how a lot of people got out. We know they crossed the Pyrenees on foot. We know they entered Spain at Portbou. We have the documents for that. And then they took a train to Vigo, and they boarded the ship in Vigo in February 1941. And that ship went straight to Rio. So that's how they got to Brazil. And they disembarked in Brazil in early March 1941. The thing about looting, it depends what you mean by looting. You know, if we're talking about the expropriation of property against someone's will, I think it went on and on and on. The first instance was October 33. All of his assets in Germany were confiscated by the state. This was a very slow and painstaking process. German bureaucracy is very thorough, even to this day. So in October 33, there was a decree freezing his assets, not confiscating. And then the actual process, which eventually led to his expulsion from the German nationality, was only finalized in 37. So it took 4 years. During those 4 years, his assets weren't available to him in Germany. Although we know that some of the artworks he managed to get out early, between 33 and 34. We assume that's when the bulk of the collection left Germany and went to Switzerland and France, because after 34, 35, it would have been impossible. Then in June 1940, immediately after the Nazi invasion of Paris, the ERR went to his apartment in Rue de Grenelle, which is in 7th arrondissement in Paris, and they confiscated about 6 or 7 crates of artworks, household goods, furniture, and took them to the Jeu de Paume. So if you talk about looting in the strict sense of people going into raiding apartments and stealing things, I would say twice, or 4 times. 2 is his house in Berlin, his house in Zelo, which is in Brandenburg, and his apartment in Paris and his office in Paris. Those were actually instances of looting. But if we're talking about spoliation, I would say the spoliation just goes on and on. We're hitting 75 years of spoliation and counting. Hugo Zeman applied for restitution, indemnization actually, for spoliated properties in 1945. But his situation was very difficult. Hugo Zeman was in Brazil as a refugee, and he entered Brazil with a false passport. He had no papers whatsoever. And when he emerged from hiding, after going to Brazil as a refugee, there was a threat of his being denounced as an illegal alien. So Hugo Zeman was in hiding until the end of the war. Then he emerged from hiding, but he had no documents. His first task was to get his identity back. He could not even claim to be Hugo Zeman because he couldn't prove it. And so he started getting letters from his friends to vouch for him. He got some good recommendations. His 2 referees were Thomas Mann and Albert Einstein, so that helped a lot. But bureaucracy for this kind of thing is slow. So by the time he died in 1950, he had not managed to get his identity back, much less anything like a passport. I mean, you have to remember there was no Germany between 1945 and 1949. The two German states were only reconstituted legally in 1949. He had been expelled from the German nationality in 1937. Basically, this means Hugo Zeman is a stateless person. He had no way to get a passport, much less a Brazilian passport. That would have been impossible. The only option, theoretically, would have been to get a UN stateless person passport. But then, the UN is not set up yet. The UN is still in its embryonic stages. This is a very complicated legal process, and he was not able to do it. He was poor in Brazil. He had no property. He had no connections. He was basically relied on a closed circle of friends. The first things they got restituted or indemnified for were 1948, and that was in the British occupied zone. Their house was bombed during the war, so there was no house, but they got the property back in 1948. That was, the first thing they got back. Otherwise, it was really a bureaucratic nightmare. His claims had not been duly processed by the time of his death in 1950. And my great-grandmother continued to make claims her whole life. My grandmother, his daughter, continued claims her whole life. These claims have been ongoing from 1950s, 60s, 70s. I made my first claim in 1992, just as the window of opportunity was closing for ex-GDR claims here in Germany. I made a family claim in 92, which is open to this day. Real estate, properties we've gotten back, works of art from the German government, from museums. But there's a continuous history of claims from June 1945 to now. The Pechstein painting in the Pompidou is an interesting story. They were aware that they had a problem with provenance fairly early on. The way I learned about the painting was very cloak and dagger, actually. I have a friend who's married to a retired French diplomat. And this retired French diplomat called me one day and said, "I need to speak to you, but it has to be somewhere where we won't be overheard. It has to be in a public place, like a cafe." And I said, "Okay, fine." And then I went there, and he hands me a little, dossier, and he says, "This painting is in the Pompidou, and we know that there's a problem with provenance, and you need to look at this." And this was the first knowledge I had of it. I think this is a funny thing about provenance research. People know that there are secrets, that there are skeletons in the closet, and they know that people are hiding things. Everyone is aware that everyone else knows that there are things that shouldn't be talked about. And now I think this is starting to change. Max Pechstein was one of the most important expressionist painters, one of the leading painters in Germany in the 1910s and 20s, member of the movement called Die Brücke, and I think one of the most representative names in German expressionism. We don't know exactly when this painting entered his collection. It was painted in 1912, and Pechstein and Hugo Simon were moving in the same circles at this time. They both lived in the same neighborhood of Berlin, Zehlendorf. It's very likely that they knew each other personally. We know it was in the collection by the 1920s. In 1928, Hugo Zeman loaned it to an exhibition at the National Gallery in Berlin. And then it's one of the paintings that he moved out of Germany during exile. And in 1938, there was the big exhibition of German art in the exile communities. It ended up being curated in London by Herbert Reed. But the mastermind behind it originally was Paul Westheim, the German art critic who was exiled in Paris and was a very close friend of Hugo Zeman. He obviously could not access any works that were in Germany, so he had to find works that were available in collections outside Germany. And Hugo Zeman was one of his main sources. This Pechstein painting was definitely in the London exhibition. In the catalog, it has a label on the back. It probably did take part in the Paris exhibition because it disappeared after the war. And then one day, in 1966, it turned up in the basement of the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, which is where the storage was for the new National Museum of Modern Art. And then they found the painting, and one of the curators, who was, immediately recognized that it was an important painting and decided that he would salvage it. And then they decided to do something a little bit irregular. They just simply added it to the collection. There's no sale, there's no purchase, there's nothing. It didn't enter the collection in a normal way, which is the whole reason why 50 years later we managed to get it back, because it's completely irregular and illegal in the French museum world to simply add a found work to a collection. There has to be, it has to follow certain rules and procedures. And since those weren't followed, when we applied to the French Spoliation Commission for restitution, They were able to do research and find out that the painting was, in fact, added to the collection in an illegal manner. That means that it never actually belonged to the French state. It should never have been in the books. And they recognized this. The French Commission was very thorough and very correct and good about this. And they took their time. You obviously have to take your time when you're dealing with something this important. And so it took a few years, but finally in 2020, they voted for restitution. Because of the pandemic, we were unable to actually stage the restitution ceremony until 2021. The painting went on display at the Musée National d'Art Moderne, the Pompidou, in June 2021. Just before it was returned to us, we arranged with the Pompidou for them to have a sort of goodbye exhibition for it. The painting was actually taken down from the wall and shipped to New York to take part in the Afterlives exhibition at the Jewish Museum. We were very pleased as a family to have it in the exhibition. As Sam Sakharov and Darcy Alexander explained to us, this is the most recently restituted object in the show, and we were thrilled to be able to play that role in the exhibition. The story of restitution is an ongoing one. It's not something in the past. It's not Monuments Men, it's not 1945. It's here and now, and I think actually we're starting a whole new chapter